lockdown could certainly have been avoided had the government acted about 5 weeks sooner than they did. And I think, although, as you say, this is not the most libertarian of policies to impose a restriction on movement, it does at least adhere to the primary function of the state, which is to keep the citizenry safe. Do you think that trade-offs like that are sensible and acceptable in times like these?
I think you always have to be willing to contemplate trade-offs. Let's pretend it isn't COVID, and let's pretend that it is 1939 and we actually have a threatening, growing fascist regime, and that's what's the risk. Are we going to say there would be no trade-off between rights and the way we have to effectively defend ourselves in the longer term? We would be mad, wouldn't we, to try and suggest such a thing. Indeed, that was probably what Chamberlain was after, and he was wrong. And so there will have to always be a trade-off, but it should be the least possible trade-off balanced against the risk that's really faced. And so to me, restricting movement at the outer extremities of the nation's border is a fairly minimal infringement, especially if you're leaving people to relatively get on with their lives within the borders. That's relatively minimal and might be proportionate. You have to be willing to contemplate these things, even to act on these things, but they should always be as minimum as possible. And this is why I have such an objection to the emergency powers sunset clause being so far down the track. It's ludicrous that in a free country, such powers would be signed off for such a period of time. If they were still needed, they could be voted for every 3 months, and that would be fine. But to just automatically set it for 2 years, that's absolutely the wrong thing. And it's this whole attitude towards freedom and liberty that we're seeing is changing, and people just don't care enough, or they trust their government too much. And maybe they'll be lucky this time. Maybe we can depend on the fact that our present government is benevolent in dealing with the crisis, but they won't all be.
Are you quite surprised at the fact that the response from the British people regarding what is essentially a very extreme measure, that is to lock down the UK, has been met by a very docile reaction from the public?
I have reflected on it. I'm not sure that it is docile as much as consenting. We believe in policing by consent in this country. That's one of the principles of policing that stems right from the founding of the police by Sir Robert Peel. And in reality, just from purely pragmatic terms, policing is done by consent because there just aren't enough police to enforce all the laws if everyone decided they were rubbish laws and they didn't want to follow them. So I think what we saw was consent. Whether one believes that they ought to have consented so readily is a different thing. But I think what we're seeing now is that consent is gradually being retracted, in that people are now getting back to work, being less strict on themselves. That seems to be the gist of what we're seeing out there.
Well, in favour of sticking with oil is the fact that we've got so much expertise and knowledge and innovation from it. This is the thing that we're used to. And to move towards a renewable energy source would require us to start the textbook again from scratch.
Well, there is that, but at the same time, we don't want to be making decisions because they feel like protectionism. We should be making them, in my view, from the basis of individual liberty. And so I'm almost tempted to say, let the market decide. If oil dies, it's because nobody wants it, and not because the government or legislature or lobbyists or whatever have been able to get the power of the state to choose winners and losers. That's my preferred outcome.